Welcome to my show, Food for Therapy. I'm your host, Therese Bolden. Welcome to my show, the show that combines my training and specialty of psychotherapy and counselling, personal development and writing with my passion for food and hosting and culture. And on today's episode, a guest who needs no introduction, the lovely Melody Horrill. Welcome to my home and welcome to my table.
Oh, lovely to be here.
So Melody is the wonderful broadcast journalist, marine mammal conservationist, an author, a documentary filmmaker, producer, and a domestic violence survivor. And our topic for today is a big one. It's domestic violence. So for all of you out there who are concerned about the signs and relationships that you're entering, maybe you're worried that someone you know is in a domestic abusive relationship, you're going to want to stay tuned. So Melody, I just wanted to acknowledge the food. It is a big topic for us today.
Yes,
so I want to keep it light with the food, high tea. We've got some gluten-free sandwiches because I am gluten intolerant. So we've got smoked salmon, cream cheese and dill.
beautiful.
We've got curried egg with whole egg mayonnaise, and they're also on gluten-free bread. I made a frittata this morning, and the little bites at the top is a combination of assorted desserts with chocolate and cheesecake and yo-yos and strawberries, all that feel-good stuff. So I just wanted to get started with a beautiful excerpt that I read in your book. You said this was such a beautiful, beautiful piece, and it instantly transported me to my own experience of domestic violence. And it was, my TV persona had always disguised a niggling fear that I would never amount to anything, something I learnt from my father. As a child, he reminded me of my uselessness during those times he actually acknowledged me. And when I read that in the Sunday Life, immediately I felt like I had a sisterhood with you, because it's not something that I discuss with people very often, Melody. I talked a little bit about it in my first book, released in Spirit and the Soul of Therapy in 2009, but it was very kind of high level.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really discuss it with people, but there seemed to be this immediate affinity with you, and that's why I reached out to you.
Oh, well, I'm so pleased you did. And let me say thank you so much for the beautiful spread. Firstly, amazing. And thank you for inviting me to your home.
My pleasure.
And also thank you so much for taking the time to read the book. I never take it for granted that someone's picked it up and used their valuable time to immerse themselves in my story. What a privilege that is. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
No, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. But I want our audience to understand what made you want to write the book. What was the genesis of the book?
I've been wanting to write this book for as long as I can remember, to be honest with you. I think I just didn't know how to. I mean, the idea of writing a book is terrifying, really. Just the sheer amount of work that's required and having to dig deep and think about things that perhaps you don't particularly want to think about. So the whole idea of writing the book was always within me, something I'd wanted to do, but felt that I never would achieve it. The thing that prompted me to actually write the book was when I found out what was happening with my precious Port River dolphins, actually. I penned an article for the Weekend Australian magazine, and I spoke a little bit in that article about the Port River dolphins, the fact they were dying, and my special relationship with one of them. And I had such a remarkable response from that article. I had people contacting me saying, firstly, that they were amazed about the story, and secondly, they started reaching out about their own lives and how wonderful it was that they were actually reading something that resonated with their own life, and it mattered to them. And it mattered that I had written this article. And I was so grateful for those comments and that feedback from people I didn't even know who'd picked up Weekend Australian, read the magazine, read my words, and those words seemed to have such an impact. So I guess it was a combination of really wanting to write the story to help raise awareness about the dolphins and for me, how amazing these mammals are and why they need to be protected, but also because I felt it could actually help others. And the feedback I'd had from the article confirmed that. So it was those two things, that recognition that perhaps my words could make a difference to people and to the dolphins.
Oh, they're beautiful. I told you the first time that we met, I mentioned to you that I found your book to be tremendously, tremendously spiritual.
Wow.
And, you know, there were so many parallels in your book with my life when you spoke about your life and how harrowing it was. There were so many parallels, but there were so many differences as well. You know, your love of animals and your love of the horses and the dolphin called Jock. Beautiful, beautiful. I even hearing and reading and the way that you describe your relationship with this dolphin, for me was like, what a blessing that she had something that helped her move through this.
Totally.
So tell us a little bit about that. How did Jock help you through this?
Sure. Well, I guess going back, it wasn't just Jock that actually helped me through the trauma, I guess, of living in an environment that was far from ideal. Animals, when I look back on it, and I didn't realise what kind of impact they'd had until I started writing the book and really thinking about it. But all of the animals in my life were, for me, things that I could turn to, that I could trust.
Right.
I couldn't really trust people,
right,
but I could trust the animals in my life. And they were there as my companions, non-judgmental companions.
Yeah.
From pretty much as long as I can remember. From, you know, Puss, my cat, through to Eddie, my horse. And then, even though Jock was a completely wild animal and not a domesticated animal, but Jock showed me so much in many ways, because my relationship with him was based on one of trust. And I really hadn't trusted many things in my life up until that point. And meeting this, and he was a solitary wild dolphin, and I think it's really important for me to say that he was never coerced, never fed. He interacted with myself and the research team on his own basis, purely because he wanted to.
So when you say research team, but what got you to the point of actually meeting him or connecting with him?
Well, I'd actually hadn't finished year 12, and I decided one day after my father went to jail for attacking my mother, that I really did need to go back and finish my schooling. So I decided to do that. Went back part-time to finish my year 12, got myself into university, because I realised that education was the only way that I was going to try and move out of this sort of dark space and also give myself some hope for my own future. That was a way.
Right.
And I had a lecturer called Dr. Mike Bosley, and he was my psychology lecturer. I majored in psychology, I think partly because I was trying to understand the things that were happening in my own life.
Well,
right?
This is what I did. I studied, so my postgrad was psychotherapy counselling.
Yeah.
I did my thesis in grief. I studied acting, I studied writing, all to understand what was going on in this home.
Yes.
It's like your psyche needs to pinpoint what is this? What is this madness that you're going through? Yeah, the same kind of very similar experience in that way. Please continue.
Thank you. But no, I completely agree with you. It's fun, isn't it? We search for answers. We search for reasons.
Yeah.
And so I majored in psychology, and Mike was one of my earliest psychology lecturers. But not only was he a psychologist, he was also a marine biologist. So he had two disciplines, and he was studying these wild dolphins in the Port River in South Australia. And he was talking about these dolphins in one of the first lectures that I went to at university. And I was just fascinated, really. I listened to Mike talk about the dolphins, about how captive dolphins should not be in captivity. and his work with these wild dolphins in the Port River. And I don't know, something sparked my imagination and sparked my heart that day. I'd seen dolphins once before on a ship, but never actually close up in real life before. And so I just really, really wanted to go out and see these dolphins. And I actually approached him at the end of one of the lectures and said, "Do you need some help? Because I'd like to volunteer."
I remember reading that. Yes.
And so I offered to volunteer on this project, this research project, and that's how I actually ended up meeting Jock and the other dolphins. And these dolphins, there are so few places in the world where dolphins live so close to a capital city as they do in Adelaide.
Right.
And the Port River isn't an ideal environment, and it has a long history of industry and pollution. And Jock was one of the first dolphins I saw when I went out. And it was remarkable, really, because he was a solitary dolphin. His dorsal fin was terribly mangled from being caught up in years of fishing line.
Yeah.
And he wasn't interacting with any other dolphins. And dolphins are such social creatures.
Yeah, I do know that about
really
them.
Odd.
I know. Yeah.
And I sat on that boat and something just resonated in me. I felt this compassion towards this dolphin, partly because I think of his external injuries, and I thought, gosh, what have you been through, and what have we done to you as a species? But he seemed to me to be so adrift and lost. And so that really reflected how I was feeling inside, though very few people knew that.
Yeah.
And so I felt this immediate connection with this completely wild animal. And over a course of 3 years, I got to know Jock very well and spent a lot of time in the water with him and hanging out with him. And he was probably the first thing in my life that gave me true unconditional acceptance and friendship.
Wow.
And that was mind-blowing for me, because the other animals in my life, there's always that, well, I'll feed you and look after you, and you'll show me affection and attention. It was a two-way street. But with Jock, he didn't want anything else other than my company. And how privileged was I that this wild animal in his own environment was accepting me and trusting me, despite the fact that he had been hurt so much by my species. So I learned a lot about forgiveness.
Oh, wow.
The fact that he embraced my presence without any enticement after what he'd gone through. He'd had a spear in his side, he was meshed up in fishing line, and yet he still accepted me.
So what do you think that was, that you had this symbiosis with this creature who you would expect be resistant to human interaction? What do you think that was?
I can't speak for Jock because he's a dolphin, but I have to say, for me, I felt that I'd met my soulmate in a way. Yeah, really, even though he was a different species and an aquatic species, and I'm a land species. It was remarkable, and just the fact that he made me feel worthy, I guess, in many ways, because he didn't demand anything of me other than my company. And who does that?
Yeah, especially when you have that experience. I don't often reflect on what it made me feel like to grow up in a home with domestic violence, because it takes you to a place, as you and I have discussed before, where I felt hopeless and worthless. And there was many times where I would just look at my father and, I loved him so much. And vied for his attention for a long time. And every time he'd make a promise and break it, my heart would be broken again and again and again. But when I do reflect on that time, and I wonder how I got through, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, there was something inside of me that always told me I was greater than my circumstance. There was something in me. I didn't have an affinity with a beautiful mammal like Jock.
I was lucky.
You were very lucky.
So blessed.
You were lucky.
So blessed.
But I had a vivid imagination and I daydreamed constantly, which is actually a sign of someone who's in an abusive environment as well. That really, for me, was my escape. And I always felt that I somehow didn't belong in my family because my thinking was always very different to theirs. But being in that environment, can you just share with me a little bit about that, what that was like for you?
Being in the water with Jock, or my
home environment?
Because
we've got a picture of what it was.
Okay, let me go back.
Yeah.
Look, it was. There was no joy really in the house, and my mother and father just seemed to hate each other really, and even when they weren't at each other, when there wasn't physical violence, there was this sort of electricity in the air that was palpable. You could feel the tension grow between them.
Yeah.
And you were just counting down to the next day that they were going to clash violently again. And I really felt insignificant and helpless and powerless. And I was told often by my father that, I was useless and nothing would become of me. And of course, I believed that. But there was also something in me which put up a fight. And as I got older, when we came out to Australia, because I was born in the UK, I found myself being the voice for my mother in many respects.
Yeah,
I would
Same.
get between my mother and father, and I would be the one trying to break things up or call the police or try and, get them to stop. And you get whacked in the crossfire sometimes. I was lucky in that my father, I don't recall a time when he ever actually brought the belt down on me. He did with my siblings, my brothers and my sisters. But I guess it was just that feeling of helplessness, and then growing up and thinking, no, I have to fight back somehow. This can't be right. And it is, I don't know about you, but I looked for any escape. And for me, my escape was my animals and my imagination and reading books. But I fairly early on started having panic attacks at night. I know what they are now. Back then I didn't know.
You don't have a name for it, do you?
No. And who do you talk to about it?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then, of course, all the neighbours know
Yes.
what's going on in your house.
Yes.
And at school, the kids knew.
Yes, but you can't talk about it.
You can't talk about it, but they knew.
Because you have this code of, in my culture, in my Egyptian culture, and my mother would make it very clear to us, we were always forewarned before we'd go anywhere. You never talk about what's going on in the home, which breeds contempt and it breeds silence, and silence breeds shame. And you're left with this big, it's like a big boulder on your shoulders that's just so heavy, and you think that, when you're very young, I mean, my first memories were, I think, 2 years old, I can remember, because you always remember what's the most emotional, what's the most heightened emotion is what you remember.
You do.
But I think that being told that you're not to discuss this, for me, was tormenting inside. It was, how do you work and process something that is wrong, intuitively, instinctively, is wrong. And in my home, my mother was the protector. She was the one that took care of us. My father never physically beat my brother or I, but we were witness to his beatings for her. And it marks you. It leaves you with tremendous sadness and tremendous hopelessness, because you're a part of him and you're a part of her, and he's eviscerating her, beating her to a pulp, and it just goes on and on and on. But when I was doing research recently for my for my film on domestic violence, and I was looking at the symptoms for children that grow up in these homes. Very early on, there is obviously extreme anxiety separation, which I recall my brother having. Extreme anxiety separation. Bedwetting, which happened for both of us. What else? And then you get to, primary school, and you get bullied or you bully. And then you get to high school, and then the kids start acting out when they're growing up in these environments. They can turn to drugs, they can become aggressive, they can become violent. And it goes on and on and on. And often we hear about women that are in these situations. We don't often hear from the children that grow up.
No.
Do you know what I mean?
It's very true.
We
Very
don't.
true.
And
No,
you
we
and I
don't.
are a testament to that. I know from our conversations how much you've worked to work through that, and how much you've focused on making yourself the most successful that you are, and you'll continue to do that. The same for me, because somewhere inside me, the person that's supposed to love me the most, my father, I guess he did in his own way, because what else did he know? He had mental illness, he had bipolar, he had narcissistic personality disorder as well. But you're marked. And no matter how much work you do on yourself, and no matter how much analysis or therapy you have, you're still going to have that with you. You know?
I agree. That's all very true. And you're right, we don't hear much from the children, do we?
No.
And I think that I can only speak for myself, but I think the same is true of you, is when you feel powerless, you work your entire life to regain your power.
Yeah.
And often that means trying to achieve, trying to have a voice. And it is very difficult in those formative years to find that.
Of course.
But as you grow older, I found myself becoming more intent on proving my father wrong.
Yes.
And proving to him, even though he's no longer around, that actually his forecast for my future was completely incorrect.
Yeah.
And for me, it was about not being defined by my past,
right?
By moving beyond that. And I used that pain, I guess, to my advantage in some respects, because I channeled it into energy to create something positive for my life. And I think you're doing exactly the same. So as awful as that time was, in some respects now, I think back to it and I think, no, I wasn't lucky to have that, but how much did I learn from
Exactly.
that?
Oh, no, I totally see it that way. The silver lining that came out of it.
Yeah. How much do you learn?
Absolutely.
You've become an incredibly insightful woman with huge empathy, who is setting out to educate others and to share your story. That's remarkable.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't be this woman today.
No. I actually, spoke to a colleague recently about that. It informs you in every way. But even the fact that, in domestic violence, there's so much awareness around it. But in 70s,
there was nothing.
The police wouldn't get involved. People that would help my mother were also the people that encouraged her to go back, which was the church, the Coptic church.
Right.
So our crisis accommodation would be in a room, a dark room that smelt of mothballs. I remember that smell, and the red carpet on the ground, and the 2 single beds, and my twin brother and I would sleep in one, and my mother would sleep in another. And that was our crisis accommodation. And she left again and again and again. And they would encourage her to go back to support the family.
Right.
You need to support him.
Wow.
You made this choice.
Yeah, right.
And so for me, I think this is part of the reason why I've moved away from religion, is it's that and also the fact that I could never get an answer to the question about the Coptic religion, the Christian religion. There was never an answer that was sufficient for what I needed to understand. And seeing how pervasive patriarchy was in our culture, it's really about the man and his needs, and no one ever stopped to consider what was going on for her. I mean, she definitely had post-traumatic stress. You know, she willed herself to death, and this is when I came to learn about the power of words and thoughts. Over and over and over, her mantra was, my only way out of this is through death.
Wow.
And that's what she got when she turned 43.
Wow.
She died in 6 months from breast cancer. So, and I learnt the power of words. And I would say to her often, stop saying that. Leave if you don't want to be with him. Just stop saying it. And yes, she had agency and she chose to stay in that. But when you're constantly being told inadvertently, directly, by society, by social norms, by the church, that you should stay for the sake of your family, and you should stay because you chose to marry, what other choice do you have?
I know. Religion wasn't the issue in
I know.
But
yeah.
But I would question my mother when I was very young, asking her why she stayed with my father. And she would say, I can't afford to leave. I have all you kids.
Yes.
Where am I going to go?
Yes.
My parents, she only had a father, I think, even at that point.
Yes.
He said, you've made your bed, you lie in it. This is what the situation is. So I think she felt that she was trapped. She had nowhere to go because there were no domestic violence services. No one talked about it.
If they got called out, I do remember the police coming to the apartment, because we used to live in Caulfield, so we lived close. Yeah. They would be called out because the neighbours would call them. Right. But they would say, this is between you and your husband, which is, And the thing with that is, and we know through domestic violence with women, is that you leave, you come back, you get this sense of hopelessness. And even though my mother was the one that was working, even though she made the money, there was coercive control. Wow. She'd hand over her pay packet. Wow. She would give it to him. And they would encourage her. The church encouraged her to do this. So I feel that society still has a long way to go, in supporting, because when you're dealing with domestic abuse, you're not just dealing with someone who's being physically, you're dealing with coercive control, financial control, Stockholm syndrome, manipulation, coercion, and on and on and on. And, victims of domestic abuse would leave, and then, their psyche starts to believe that I can't leave. I've got nowhere to go. And this is how they attach in terms of Stockholm. So they start to identify with the person. Part of that codependency is the identification with the abuser, and that you feel sorry and that you feel bad and on and on and on. So it's something that's really, stayed with me. And ironically, a few years ago, I was at a shopping mall close to where I grew up, and I bumped into someone who I knew when I was very, very young in Sunday school, and she felt the need to unpack her abusive relationship with me. Can you believe it? In a shopping mall.
Wow.
Yeah, we hadn't seen each other for 30 years, but she wants to unpack it all. And she proceeded to tell me that she'd been in an physically abusive and emotionally abusive marriage for 30 years. Wow. And she's raised her children in that, couple of girls. And that, sooner or later he's going to die. He's sick. And she was wishing death and damnation on him. And then she proceeded to ask me when I was coming back to the church and come to confession. That's what she said.
What did you say?
I started laughing. I actually started laughing. She said, you have to come to confession after she's wished death and damnation on this man.
Oh, dear.
And can't leave the church, can't leave the husband. Wow. It's palpable. It's still there. It's really strong for people. And that's all you know. That's she's counting her days to when she can leave. Yeah. It's
well, with my mother, I found myself taking on the role of mother.
Same, a parentified child.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
yes.
The roles,
same. Yes,
completely
but
switched. It was always a subtle thing. It was happening,
Yeah.
and then one day, I remember saying to my mother, she was sitting on the back step of the house, and she was bleeding, I think, from the nose or the mouth, and they'd had another horrible fight. And I said to her, "Someone is going to die in this house. It's either going to be your dad or me or the three of us. Once someone's going to die. So you have to go. We have to go." And that was the thing. That was the point when I took over being the parent, really and truly, because from that point on, I almost felt it was my responsibility.
But you do, because
because
in your mind, my mind, like I always knew that as a young girl, when I would look at her and see that she was being victimized and being abused by him, I always knew that I was different to her and that I would never accept that from someone. And we spoke about this as well. You just know that. And so I would say to her when I grew up, just leave. I mean, he stopped beating her around the time that we were probably 8 or something. But the emotional and psychological and the codependency, it didn't end. It never ended.
No.
And she said, when you have children, you'll understand. And I understand the unconditional love I have for my children, but thankfully I've chosen partners and husbands that have been a wonderful, wonderful men, wonderful examples.
And you've made that conscious choice.
I have made that conscious choice.
Because you know that there are lines in the sand that you will not cross.
I know.
And there are standards which you have, which are important to you because you've lived it and you're conscious of not repeating the cycle. Yeah. Really conscious of it.
Yeah. And so for me it was because as she grew older and they would argue and you could hear it. You're trying to study, you're doing HSC and you can hear them yelling, feel the tension, and she'd be crying and waiting for me to wake up. And all she ever wanted, and she said to me, I don't care if you get married. All I want you to do is be educated.
Good on
you.
her.
Have to be educated because you cannot rely on a man. And that was her dying wish, So it really does. There is a silver lining to it, yes, of course. But you live your lifetime trying to figure out what that is, as you said.
Yeah, you do. It takes you years to work it out. I agree.
Yeah. You live your whole life, and certain things remind you of it. When you're seeing someone entering into a relationship that's codependent, and you get triggered by all those things. It's there. It's always it's always going to be there.
But it's also, in a way, I think, has made the whole experience, particularly with my mother and swapping those roles over, where I became the mother in the relationship. Actually, very early, much earlier than when I said it's about time you leave. I became protector mother.
Same.
Many, many years before that.
My mother would say to him, "I'm going to tell Therese what you've just said, what you've done."
Yeah, right.
That's what she'd say to him.
It's like children. Yeah. It's like you're living with
children.
I'm
going to tell Therese. That's what she'd say to him.
Wow. But I think that whole experience has certainly made me have more empathy, I think, towards other people generally. When you feel that you're taking responsibility, as I did with my mum, for her life, really, to get us out of that situation, it made me feel way more able to understand what others around me, the emotions and the background and the pain that others around me were feeling. And I think you carry that on in life as well.
You do.
Experience something
and
like
we're
that.
very similar in that. You do. Stay tuned for the next episode of Domestic Violence, where I continue my discussion with Melody and we highlight the support networks that are available.